One of the best things about Genshin Impact that Prevailing Wisdom is in agreement on is how characters can stay relevant in the game for long stretches of time, potentially spanning multiple years. Even better would be the ones who could fit into virtually any team composition and achieve the same result. Having stable units with that kind of versatility not only streamlines the team building experience, but ensures a modicum of stability when tackling the endgame, knowing there's always a fallback you can rely on. An example being the Raiden national team being responsible for carrying the majority of players for nearly 2 years. Only an exceptional few can adequately claim to have that sort of history, either because they simply haven't been around for that long, or their strength was most likely contingent on some other external factor, not necessarily them. And even among the few deserving to fit into that category, fewer still are those with the same tenure as the Geo Archon. Zhongli came out back in version 1.2 and has been a mainstay in Genshin's metagame all the way up until the present day. But unlike his peers who upheld their status by adapting to new characters and playstyles, Zhongli was characterized for doing the same exact thing he's been doing since the day he came out. While that's been doing well for him so far, how much longer can he hold out for? And could his recent decline in popularity be a good indicator of the game's accelerating power scaling? For today's What Happened to episode, we'll be discussing the Geo Archon. Before we get into the video though, I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor. At Apocalypse, the Scarlet Covenant is back once again to grace us with their infinite wisdom of waifus. As a recap, Apocalypse is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi mobile strategy RPG that has you lead a bunch of kimono girls, so all of you culture waifu enjoyers can feel right at home here. Celebrating their new Witches Whispers event, there's gonna be a new game mode called Witches Den with new Witches characters if it wasn't obvious, and each one has a unique interactive setup and AI-powered responses. In addition, we have another new character coming out, Anna, and just like Rosabelle last time, she comes with an oat skin. Holy shit, I'm gonna get demonetized. At present, Anna's the top DPS unit in the game, so she's got practical value in addition to her big personality. Further, there's a new 150-day sign-in event that's taking place, offering up to 24 SSRs and 6 ultra-rare characters over that time, including Witch Prinny from the Witch's Den. Last main thing to note is that they're including a bonus recharge event with up to a 2000% rebate and a ton of discounts during this time. By logging in via GT Arcade, you're allowed to participate in the event and gain access to bonuses whenever you top up. If you're interested in picking up a new game to pass the time, if you know what I mean, feel free to check out Apocalypse using my gift code VARS2824 and you'll get 150 Iridium Morphites, 3 random SSR Affinity gift bags, and 5 mission data force. Good luck on getting Anna, but for now, let's get back to the video. More than being meta-resilient by not being dependent on anything, Zhongli's unique in a myriad of ways, not the least of which being the fact that to this day, he is the only character in Genshin Impact to have received direct balance changes on a considerable scale. In his defense, he really needed it. On release, Zhongli was so underwhelming, especially for an Archon. He was borderline as awful as Chi-Chi, that's how bad and situational he was. Following the changes to his skin, however, he went from one of the most niche units to one of the most universal ones. In fact, an argument can be made that Hoyo overcorrected him. Going by the scale of the present day, that wouldn't be the case, but certainly back then, calling Zhongli a must-pull would have been an understatement to say the least. Everyone wanted to have this man for one reason or another. Though he belongs to objectively the worst element in the game, Geo, owing to its offensive incompatibility with any of the other elements, Zhongli effectively ditched all of that by focusing on more weaponizable traits of the element, that being his tanky defensive nature. Among the shielders, he was by far the best in the realm of absolute value. Zhongli's Jade Shield far eclipsed any other shielding character in the game throughout version 1, 2, and even 3. Miles ahead of Diona, Toma, Kirara, Layla, Xinyan, and so on. By stacking enough HP and factoring in the universal absorption the team gets along with the occasional iframes afforded to us during elemental burst animations, a single cast of Dominus Lapidus would allow you to effectively sustain one's entire health bar's worth of HP before the shield would actually break, at which point the relatively short 12-second cooldown of his skill would be up, allowing him to recast his shield and give you pretty much infinite durability. Players made liberal use of Zhongli's incredible shielding capability by essentially face tanking the entire game. No possible combination of enemies in Spiral Abyss between versions 1 and 2 dealt enough DPS to the team to break through the Jade Shield faster than Zhongli could generate a new one. The practical absence of any threat to one's own life at the expense of a small amount of DPS resulted in many players consciously foregoing the use of Zhongli for the simple fact that he basically stripped away any semblance of difficulty from the game. Even the marginal loss of DPS could be overlooked when you consider the Jade Shield carried the ability to shred the resistance of all nearby opponents by 20%. Granted, that pales in comparison to what the likes of Kazuha, Bennett, and Yelan provided, but seeing as it came with literal invincibility, no one complained about that. More importantly, however, was the DPS the party gained by not having to waste time moving around. For any team without a shield or a measure of super armor, when struck by a sufficiently powerful enough attack, they would either get staggered or outright knocked away. For instance, blowing up a pyro slime barrel will send you flying for a good second or two. consequently leading to loss in damage as you're not attacking during this time. Only until recently did more units come out who can attack while moving like Neuvillette, Mavuika, and Chaska. The very high likelihood of you getting staggered in a fight forces players to actively move around, jumping, sprinting, what have you to avoid enemy hits. One of the reasons Zhongli made the game so laughably easy was that in addition to protecting you from taking damage, how shields work is that the shielding amount superimposed above your health bar acts as a separate entity, taking the attack in your place instead. What this means is that in the eyes of the game, it's as if you didn't get hit by an attack at all, thereby not being affected by whatever potential knockback you were intended to sustain. In simple terms, shields come with built-in super armor, not resistance to being staggered, immunity from being staggered. You could have 1,000 rune guards pounding away at you and then just sit there being none the wiser to them, which is what people did. They didn't care about avoiding attacks, they just went about their full combos. For any character who depended on long animations without being able to dodge, shields were practically obligatory. Ganyu, Hutal, Lini, Neuvillette, Wander, they actively factor shields into the DPS because in this case, the best offense is a strong defense. Not being at risk of dying or getting staggered lets you attack without a care in the world. This was Zhongli's primary and frankly only selling point for the entirety of his tenure. Sure, there were a couple other things he could do, but he was basically really freaking good at doing one single thing, excessively if not needlessly good at doing that one single thing that there was nary a reason for him to do anything else. It's true Zhongli had no elemental compatibility with the rest of his team, but that was hardly a concern by virtue of his job being to make his teammates do their jobs more easily. It bears underscoring that up until late version 3, the majority of teams only had a hard requirement of 3 party members, with the 4th slot being a flex. Typically he would have to fight for that spot with Venin and Kazuha, but when he had that they didn't was comfort and consistency. Even if the latter two could offer more of a DPS increase, Zhongli made the team easier to play, and besides, extra DPS was often superfluous around that time. To give you even more perspective on how influential Zhongli was in the early metagame, Hoyo literally had to create the Rift-Hound enemy type as a counter to him, enemies who could apply damage over time that ignored shields, aka corrosion, meaning if you brought Zhongli into a Rift-Hound chamber, your team would still be able to tank all other attacks, but the corrosion damage would eventually kill your entire party unless you killed everything fast enough. The irony is that most of the time that's exactly what players did. They simply cleared the enemy chamber before they bled out. The only time corrosion was actually an issue was if there were multiple chambers in succession of each other involving Rift-Hounds. However, if only one of the 3 had it, so long as you made it past that chamber, you could reliably take on the other 2 chambers without losing so much as even a single point of health. Besides, depending on what blessing cards you got, some of them could restore your party's HP by a flat amount or heal you with every elemental burst cast, ultimately rendering corrosion a minor inconvenience that failed to undermine Zhongli like it was intended to. Higher investment players could take all aspects of Zhongli and amplify it several-fold, namely through his C2, causing him to give his party a Jade Shield whenever using his ultimate. Considering Planet Befall has one of the lowest energy requirements in the game and shares the same cooldown as his skill, I'd pay good folding money to find a scenario that could break through 2 Jade Shields worth of health every 12 seconds. Nearly 5 years later, the game still can't burst through C2 Zhongli, it's just that strong. Zhongli continued to have a stranglehold over the shielding department all the way up until the release of Lanyan in 5.3, being the first character in the game to surpass the Geo Archon in raw shielding value and on a 4-star no less. However, not only is her shielding not quite as unconditional as Zhongli's, it's also the literal only meaningful thing she does innately. At the very least, Zhongli can stun enemies with this burst. But while we're on the subject of Lanyan, her inclusion just so happens to illustrate the change in overall attitude people have towards healing and shielding in general. If Zhongli was so well received back in the day for his shielding capability and someone came out with even better shielding than the Geo Archon himself, why wasn't Lanyan given the same fanfare? For the better part of versions 1, 2, and 3, Zhongli was a perennial apex tier unit for his ability to trivialize and invalidate the difficulty of the game. But as he began to enter version 4, there were 2 things that took place throughout that time that negatively affected people's perception of him, and it was honestly through no fault of his own. Thing number 1, Geo's incompatibility with other elements began to actually matter. As more and more units came out, more combat engines were brought in. Dendro was already a big deal considering their emphasis on a full party of 4, but the game was beginning to bring in more teams that didn't really have the space to put Zhongli in, even for all his value. Thankfully though, it was still mostly in his favor. Neuvillette and Arlecchino, the 2 strongest attackers at the time, both had a compelling reason to include him in their lineup, the former for super armor and the latter because she outright could not heal via other sources. Further, Navia and Lini also had a worthwhile incentive to use him to facilitate what they were going to do. Even so, more teams are coming out that requiring all parts to be filled with something conducive to their end goal, a notion that got more pronounced in version 5. Version 5 outright expressly held bias towards Nanlan units being put together for the purposes of Night Soul usage. Even more so is the fact that teams beyond this point required all 4 party members to be playing to the same win condition. win conditions that Zhongli couldn't really fulfill. For example, Chasko would love to have Zhongli, but she needs PHEC characters. Ganesh and Emily need burning reactors, so that doesn't work either. Varesta doesn't really care for Zhongli, Skirk is unable to field him either despite being a normal attacker who generally wants to have a shielder. The only version 5 DPS who could pragmatically apply Zhongli is Milani basically. And much of that has to do with thing number 2. There's more competition now, a lot more competition. With the game being close to 5 years old, long-time players are getting better at min-maxing and optimization now that resources are no longer really a concern. The trade-off for fielding Zhongli was always that you would take a DPS cut in favor of comfort when playing him over the likes of Bennett and whatnot. Normally, however, the loss of DPS wouldn't matter since again, it would usually just be excess overkill damage. Now though, we're getting to a point where the DPS compromise is beginning to matter. Adding Zhongli to your team back in the day was only about maybe a 10 to 15% loss at most, but with hypercarry supports being stronger than ever, there's a huge, and I emphasize huge, disparity in damage between Zhongli and Mavuika or Zhongli and Farina or Zhongli and Zolali. The last one in particular brings up a very important point when it comes to sustain supports. You have to do more than just sustain if you want to catch people's attention, which explains why not many particularly cared about Lanyan's inclusion after the first week she came out. If you want to be known for healing and shielding, for your sake, there better be something else in your resume. Escoffier, for example, heals the entire party but hurts like a motherfucker in her own right, contributing easily anywhere between a quarter to a third of her party's overall damage in addition to the 55% shred on cryo and hydro damage. She can replenish any lost health for her team just as easily as Zhongli can prevent, but while Zhongli doesn't really do any damage of his own and he only shreds 20%, Escoffier is a veritable sub-DPS and shreds 55%. Zolali can shield the party, maybe not to the same extent as Zhongli, but circumstantially she has 20 to 40% hydro and pyro damage boost, considerable personal damage if you invest in her properly. She's a catalyst user, meaning access to Thrilling Tales, and she's a Night Soul user, meaning access to Skull Cinder City to pull a Kasaha damage boost across her entire team. Last sustain unit would be Shilonin, a fellow Geo character. Once again, Shilonin can protect her team just as well as Zhongli can, only she has Cinder City and a better shred than he does. I would argue, in terms of absolute sustain, Zhongli is still one of the best if we go by the metric of keeping the team alive, but everything's become more offensive oriented. If there's a healing or shielding support who can do just enough to pass for your dedicated sustain, in addition to doing a bunch of other things, then that's good enough for most people. On that note, there's been an interesting roller coaster between healing and shielding. At the start of Genshin, healing was thought to be strictly worse than shielding as a result of it being all-protecting and the aforementioned super armor that comes with it. All-protecting in the sense that up until Rift Towns, at any given point in time, only the active character can take damage, which means that through shields, not a single party member will get hurt. However, for healing, when people get hurt and swap out, unless you have a healing ability that affects the entire party, you could be regenerating the active character, but the moment you swap to the low HP teammate, they could die before the next tick of healing comes in. Not something you have to worry about when shielding. Then, however, things turned around for healing. Most of the healers in the game usually had better elemental application. Or should I say they had elemental application period. Zhongli's weakness of being a Geo unit prevented him from adding to Taser, Vaporize, Hyperbloom Freeze, etc., whereas the likes of Kokomi and Yao could. The need for a healer became even more paramount with the advent of Farina, who could channel party healing into an offensive parameter via fanfare stacks. As one of the 3 most valuable units in the game in my opinion, next to Bennett and Mavuika, Farina carries immense influence on the metagame. Her very existence gives healers a sizable advantage over shielders, as evident by the fact that Jean went from like a C tier 5 star to an A+ tier when the Hydro Archon first came out. Currently, healing and shielding are about even with each other in value, but I'd actually go so far as to say a non-negligible portion of Zhongli's popularity stemmed from the fact that shielding was better than healing back then. As it stands, Zhongli is no longer a top tier character. He still maintains presence in endgame content, but I'd imagine a lot of that has to do with people using him out of comfort and familiarity, not necessity. Over time, if and when we get more shielders who can shield and do something else, Zhongli's pick rate will only continue to go down. That being said, there's a very easy workaround to this. We know that Zhongli's main issue right now is that shielding alone is not sufficient enough of a selling point in this day and age, but hypothetically a support could come out who does something similar to Farina but for shielding. That is, increase party damage or give some kind of bonus based on the strength of the shield the party gets. That wouldn't help out only Zhongli but Lanyan as well, much like how Farina gave a big boost to Jean and Kokomi. Alternatively, they could play into the crowd control aspect. Zhongli is the only character in the game with a custom crowd control effect. They can push into that niche with a character that increases damage against enemies who are frozen, petrified, and so on. Plenty of ways to save the Geo Archon. If I were to be honest, I would say Zhongli has a far better chance of getting a second wind in the future than either Venti, Nahida, or Raiden Shogun. All it takes is a single support character who can turn shielding into an offensive tool, and Zhongli can skyrocket back to top tier overnight. In other words, Ong still got it, we just have to praise. What do you guys think about Zhongli? Do you agree or disagree with my analysis of him? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other What Happened to episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.